In 139 before Christ, Marco Popilio Lanus was the consul of Hispania Superior, while Quinto Servilio Scipion was the proconsul of Ulterior. As seen previously, Popilio attacked Numancia, but after defeat went to aid Scipion in Hispania Ulterior to avoid further losses against the Cjbeards. It was in this year that the combination of both Roman armies and a betrayal in the Lusitanian ranks ended the life of Viriato, and subsequently his successor, Tantalo, bringing the Lusitanian Wars to an end. In the year 138 before Christ, Popilio was named proconsul of Hispania Superior, while Decimus Junius Brutus was named consul of the Ulterior. Popilio returned from Hispania Ulterior and tried again to capture Numancia. The attack was lackluster. At the first setback, he withdrew to his province with his army. The attack had been more of a mere formality, so that in the eyes of the Senate, it could be seen that he had at least tried. Obviously, taking Numancia would give a huge boost to the general who achieved it, but this is because many had failed. Here we can see the personality of Popilio. He was a fairly cautious man who did not want to risk losing a battle resulting in a black mark on his military record. He preferred to go unnoticed. The rest of the year saw only minor skirmishes in Celtiberian lands between Romans, Numantinos, and their allies. These small fights usually resulted in victories for the Celtiberians, thanks to their knowledge of the terrain and their quite polished guerrilla tactics. For his part, Junius Brutus decided to give the veterans of the war against Viriathus lands in Valencia de Tenorum, which means City of the Brave, the current Valencia. The consul had the mission to definitively subdue the rebels, because even though the Lusitanians no longer had a united army or a single leader like Viriathus, separately they were responsible for invading Roman territory. Junius Brutus, in command of his consular army and the troops stationed in further Spain, left Cordoba for Lusitania. He quickly understood that pursuing the guerrillas was a virtually impossible task. The Lusitanians, or guerrillas from any other culture, simply fled to the mountains or forests, where they could never be found by the Romans as they knew the terrain like the back of their hand. But indeed they were all born, raised, and had families in some of the cities of Hispania. That's why the consul decided to emulate Grasso, who, as we saw in a previous video, in 180 BC, had completely destroyed the Cjbeards and had taken away their desire to fight for almost 3 decades. In this way, when the guerrillas saw their cities in danger, they would go to defend them and die on the spot, saving the legions vast amounts of time that they would have wasted combing the mountains. Although when the Cjbeards decided to rebel again, they did it in a big way. They witnessed the start of the 16-year-long Great Humiliation, a period of nearly uninterrupted conflict. So be cautious with his strategy selection. He finally started his strategy and swept through the Lusitanian territory. Apparently, part of the guerrillas were made up of Bracari soldiers, who are a tribe belonging to the Galicians, located in the north of present-day Portugal. The Roman army crossed the Douro River and dedicated itself to fighting the Bracari, basically devastating their villages and cities. Junius Brutus faced, it is not known where, a collision between Bracari and other Galician tribes, totaling 60,000 men. The Romans won the battle and as a lesson decided that they would also have to loot all of present-day Galicia. Here takes place what is possibly a legend. The Romans reached the Limia River, which they believed was the Lethe River. According to Greek mythology, the Lethe River is one of the rivers of Hades, and anyone who crosses it completely loses their memory, so the legions refuse to cross. The legend begins here, and it is said that the consul took a legion standard and crossed the river alone. From the other side of the Limia, raising the standard, he called all the legionaries of his army by their name, to prove that he had not lost his memory. His men crossed without fear and with high morale. They proceeded to devastate all the Galician territory and to take and subdue its cities. The problem Rome faced was that the cities were subdued, but when the army left them and continued with its mission, the cities would rebel again. An example mentioned by Appiano is the city of Talabrica. There is a huge confusion here. It is not known where the city was because depending on the edition of Appiano that is read, the city is called Talabrica or Lambrica, multiplying the possible places where it can be found. I simply have to mention that this city was besieged 3 times until the consul got fed up, and after winning the last time, he took away their horses, wheat, gold, and any valuable object they could possess. This campaign earned Decimus Junius Brutus the nickname of Gallico, in reference to his battles in Gaetia, present-day Galicia. Here I have to note something. The territory invaded by Brutus did not become a Roman province. Technically, they came under the dominion or protection of the governor of Hispania Ulterior, but they also retained their autonomy. This campaign had been a pacification of the territory, planting the seed for future Romanization, until they were finally fully integrated into the Roman Empire sometime later. The following year, in 137 BC, Junius Brutus received the post of proconsul in Hispania Ulterior, while Popilio was replaced by the newly elected consul Gaius Hostilius Mancinus. Mancinus headed without hesitation to Numancia, determined to take the city once and for all. He didn't know he was just another general who was going to fail in front of its walls and its defenders. The consul besieged the city, but lost every single skirmish that took place around the fortress. One day, the Numantines, aided by volunteers from allied tribes, left the city and surrounded the Roman camp. The problem was not only, as if it were not enough, that the Roman camp was surrounded, but the rumor had spread that the Cantabrians and a part of the Bacchios were on their way to help Numancia. Unable to confirm the rumors and finding himself completely cornered, the consul had to sign a peace treaty that was completely humiliating for Rome. The treaty basically stipulated that the Romans and the Numantines were equals, and that Numantia would have its autonomy guaranteed. The humiliation felt by the Senate was such that when they learned of the agreement, they ordered Mancino to return immediately to Rome to be tried, and he was replaced by the other consul of that year, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Porcina. Apparently, the rumors were false and Mancino was found guilty, although it is not exactly known of what. What is known is that he was stripped of his Roman citizenship and was handed over unarmed to the Numantines, who refused to keep him and did not even kill him. Such was the affront suffered by the Roman people that Plutarch described Mancino as the most unfortunate general among all the Romans. And returning to Hispania, Sertorius had received a new general and fresh troops, so we will soon see a new attempt to take the city. The question is, will Rome succeed this time? Year 137 before Christ. As we saw in the previous video, Mancino had made peace with the Numantines on behalf of Rome, but at the same time without Rome knowing it. That is, when the Senate heard about the pact, it had already been signed. This infuriates the senators, who quickly ordered Mancino to be tried and replaced him with the other consul, Emilio Lepido. He arrived in Hispania with orders not to wage war against anyone, as officially a peace had been declared. As I mentioned in a previous video, many praetors or consuls simply took office with the aim of gaining power and money, not caring about the lives of their men or the Republic. Lepidus was one of them. Tired of inactivity and seeing that his mandate was being consumed by the moment, he accused the Bacchios without evidence of introducing supplies into Numancia, and therefore they had to be punished. Surely the Bacchios and other tribes were covertly helping the Numantines. We will never know for certain whether Lepidus had evidence or not. The fact is that he started a war against the Bacchios. Junius Brutus, who remember was the proconsul of further Spain, had no campaigns planned for that year, so he came to the aid of Lepidus, who in addition to being consul was his brother-in-law. In command of his troops and with the support of Brutus, Lepidus invaded the territory of Baccio and besieged the city of Pallantia. There are doubts about where Pallantia was located, as it seems there were 2 cities in antiquity with the same name, both very close to each other. One of them gave rise to the current Palencia, while the other to the current Palenzuela. There is a consensus that the Palencia that was attacked is the current Palenzuela, so this latter one is the one we will take as a reference. Shortly after laying siege to the city, 2 senators arrived to order him on behalf of the Senate not to declare war, as Rome doubted whether there was really evidence that the Vaccio's had helped the Numantines. What happens is that the Senate feared that if war was declared without an appropriate casus belli, the tribes of the peninsula could rebel again, and the disasters of Numancia would be repeated throughout Hispania. They could not afford the appearance of another Viriathus. Lepidus, for his part, argued that the war had already started, and that surely the Senate did not know this, so the orders were obsolete. He also argued that if they withdrew now, they would be considered cowards, which would be even worse, so he completely ignored the senators and continued with the siege as if nothing had happened. The senators returned to Rome without achieving their goal, carrying with them letters from Lepidus addressed to the Senate with the reasons why the war should continue. Days later, an enemy army set course for Pallantia to confront the Romans and prevent the city from falling. Lepidus knew that if he faced and lost the battle, he would be forced to retreat for fear that the Vaccii and other tribes would become emboldened and annihilate his army. Skillfully, the consul spread the rumor that Pallantia had fallen to the legions and that they were preparing defenses to face the enemy army. The Vaccii, upon hearing the rumors, disbanded the army and returned to their homes, unaware that in reality, Pallantia was still under siege. Time passed, food ran out, and morale began to decrease. Over the following weeks, the Romans ended up eating their beasts of burden until they were all gone. The supplies coming from the Citerior and Ulterior provinces were very scarce, as the shipments were constantly being raided by the Cjbearian and Bactrian guerrillas. There came a point when the legionnaires began to die of starvation. Lepidus and Brutus made a decision. They had to abandon the siege and retreat from Hispania Sertorius immediately. They chose to flee the same night they made the decision. So without time to make preparations, the escape was complete chaos. Just before dawn, the legionnaires grabbed everything they could carry and headed for Roman territory, leaving behind the wounded and the sick. Tell Piano that these begged their companions to take them with them, and not to abandon them to their fate. But just in case any legionnaire decided to help, the centurions and military tribunes, let's say they helped them change their mind, so that nothing would delay the escape. With the arrival of dawn, the Vaccios discovered that the Romans were retreating, so the inhabitants of Pallantia rushed out to execute the dying who had been left in the camp. Quickly, word spread that the Roman army was fleeing. So many guerrillas hurried to harass the Roman army throughout its retreat. Another failure added to the Roman list. As soon as the news reached the Senate, Lepidus was called to Rome and no more campaigns were carried out for the rest of the year. Lepidus was fined a large sum of money for having disobeyed the Senate. In the year 136 before Christ, the consul Lucius Furius Philo was sent to Hispania Sertorius, while Junius Brutus, again with the title of proconsul, remained in the ulterior. As I narrated in the previous video, Mancinus, consul in Hispania Sertorius before Lepidus, was declared guilty of humiliating Rome, and was sent to Sertorius to be handed over to the Numantines. Furious Philo brought him naked before the walls of Numancia, but its inhabitants refused to even touch him. So Mancinus survived, and was sent back to Rome, having lost, however, Roman citizenship. Concerning battles and campaigns, this year was peaceful. Furious Philo did not want to risk attacking Numantia or Pallantia, as his predecessors had been defeated and humiliated, something that would probably also happen to him. In the year 135 before Christ, Quintus Calpurnius Piso was sent with the rank of consul to Hispania Sertorius, while Junius Brutus remained as proconsul in the ulterior. The Numantine War had resumed as the Senate considered the peace treaty inadmissible, so Calpurnius's mission was to take Numantia, but wanting to avoid a failure in front of its walls, he decided to head to take Pallantia. Once in its vicinity, he thought better of it, as Pallantia had resisted Lepidus's campaign 2 years earlier. The consul was content with looting and devastating the territory of Accio, without making any attempt to take any important city. Finally, he withdrew to his winter quarters for the rest of the year. From the behavior of the last consuls and proconsuls as well as the Senate, we can see how the resistance of the Numantines was taking a toll on the morale and conviction of the Romans. 2 years have already passed in which Numancia has not even been attacked for fear of failure. But now the Romans also dare not attack less important cities like Pallantia. The obsession of the Numantines in the defense of the city had become a symbol of resistance on the peninsula, just as Viriato was fighting for the freedom and independence of his people. Rome needed to end Numancia as soon as possible. Again, just like Viriato, everything has an end. The Roman people had already grown tired of the wars in Hispania, so they decided to send their best general to take Numancia, who was the best the Roman Republic had at that time. A general who had fought against the Carthaginians and defeated them, just as his grandfather had done 80 years earlier. His name, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. Year 135 before Christ, Calpurnius Piso was the consul of Hither Spain, with the mission to take Numantia. However, Calpurnius decided not to attack the fortress for fear of failing like his predecessors, and devoted himself to devastating the vicinity of Pallantia, to finally spend the winter in his quarters of Hither Spain. The Roman people were tired of so many defeats. There had been thousands, tens of thousands of legionnaires who had died fighting against the tribes of Hispania in the successive wars that had taken place. First there was Indibil and his constant rebellions. Lusitanian invasions followed, with Viriato taking control of nearly all of further Hispania. There had been 2 Celtiberian wars, and now the third one was being fought. Hispania was a constant hemorrhage, and Rome had said enough. She was determined to cauterize the wound. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the general who had taken the city of Carthage, grandson of the famous Scipio Africanus. He was elected consul in 134 before Christ, but there was a problem. Scipio, according to the law, was too young to be consul, so the Senate had to temporarily suspend that law. The sole priority was capturing Numancia. Interestingly, Scipio did not form any army with citizens enrolled in military service, but gathered volunteers, friends, and soldiers from allied cities of Rome who wanted to fight alongside him. Such was his fame that he did not have to force anyone to fight. He departed with 4,000 men to Hispania, where the army was stationed in the province. There he found an idle, undisciplined army given to luxuries and banalities. At that moment, Scipio understood why Numancia had not yet fallen. He expelled all the soothsayers, merchants, and prostitutes from the military camp, while also prohibiting the soldiers from carrying any superfluous objects, such as jewelry, amulets, or even dice for playing. The legionnaires could only carry a spit, a bronze pot, and a single cup. The diet would consist only of roasted or boiled meat. Finally, he banned the use of beds, being the first to lie down to rest on a bed of grass. He decreed a very demanding daily training routine. Every day they would march several kilometers on foot, with the full weight of the armor, with express orders not to use horses except for the wounded. Every day they would build a camp, dig their trenches, and raise their walls. Scipio oversaw everything, and when he gave the go-ahead, he ordered its demolition, and they resumed the march to reach another plain where they would repeat the same thing. After several weeks, when he believed the army was ready, he decided to march towards Numancia. However, his goal was not yet to assault the city, but to devastate the fields and lands of all the allies of the Numantines. Instead of sending out scouts or spreading his army to cover more ground as his predecessors had done, Scipio decided to keep his army together. For weeks they devastated all the territory of the Cjbeards. They harvested the crops, killed the animals, and everything they couldn't carry they piled up and set on fire. The Romans also attacked the settlements and made their inhabitants flee. It was a demonstration of what Rome was going to do with all the peoples of the peninsula who opposed them. The time for hesitation had ended. When Celtiberia was ravaged and Numancia relied on its neighbors, Scipio headed for Pallantia in Vaxean territory. After devastating everything in their path, they arrived at a plain near Pallantia, called Coplanio. The Romans found a huge field of wheat, seemingly defenseless and unharvested. The legionnaires began to gather the wheat, knowing that with all those supplies they would have enough for many days. Suddenly, alarm cries sounded and armed Vaxios emerged from the wheat, throwing themselves at the Romans. More warriors appeared from the adjacent forests, and a medium-sized enemy army arrived from the Roman rear. They had been surrounded. Fortunately for the Roman army, Scipio had kept all the men together so they would be able to face the enemy. Scipio ordered his cavalry to clear the rear, while his infantry retreated in formation fighting against the enemy. They managed to save themselves but were forced to leave the supplies behind, so they had to travel at night to avoid the heat and thirst, and dig wells every day to find drinking water. Scipio had been close to joining the long list of generals who had lost in Hispania. As Julius Caesar would say almost 100 years later, the die is cast. Scipio had trained his army to the maximum, had devastated Celtiberia and part of the Axian territory, so it was time to take Numancia. The siege of Numancia deserves a video all to itself, as it was a display of Roman ingenuity and technology never seen before. In my personal opinion, it is comparable to Julius Caesar's siege of Alesia. So I will now narrate the siege, but without going into much detail. If you want to know the siege in depth, in the description you have the link to the video. This sentence will be true 2 weeks after the publication of this episode. Scipio wanted to surrender the city due to hunger, not by combat. He established 2 main camps next to Numancia, and then ordered the construction of 7 forts surrounding the city. He connected these forts with trenches and palisades so that there would be a continuous wall around the citadel. He also requested troops from the allied tribes, and these, fearful upon seeing the devastation of Celtiberia, sent what the consul asked for. If the Numantines made a sortie, the Romans quickly concentrated on that point to repel them. Desperation began to spread among the Numantines, but the siege was not perfect. A Numantine leader named Retogenes managed to escape and reach Allied territory, but they refused to help him for fear of reprisals. Only one city, Lutia, decided to help them, but even before they could gather their men, Scipio was already at their gates with part of the army. The city handed over to the Romans those who supported the fight against Rome, and Scipio cut off their hands. With the revolt quelled, the Romans resumed the siege of Numancia. During the following days, the Numantines had exhausted their supplies and had begun to eat all the animals in the city. When they had eaten them all, they sent a delegation to Scipio to arrange an honorable surrender. Scipio rejected any honorable surrender. He demanded the city's unconditional surrender. The delegation returned to the city empty-handed, and upon recounting what had happened, they were killed by the very Numantines out of pure rage. Time passed, and there was not a blade of grass left in the city. Not a dog, not a rat, nothing to eat. Determined to uphold their honor and reputation as warriors, they refused to kneel before Rome, so they began to eat cooked skins, like those found on shields and footwear. When there were no skins left, cannibalism spread throughout the city, and they began to eat the dead and the sick. Finally, desperate and exhausted, they decided to kneel before Rome. But a large part of the Numantines decided to commit suicide rather than surrender to the Republic. Those who presented themselves before Rome looked terrible, dirty with wounds all over and their clothes in tatters. Scipio accepted Numantia's surrender and destroyed the city. Numantia, rather burned by flames than defeated by weapons. The Third Celtiberian War, also known as the Numantian War, had ended. 134 years before Christ, Lusitanians. Viriato has died. Celtiberians. Numancia has fallen. Hispanics, any attempt at resistance to the invader on the peninsula has been defeated. Hispania at last will be Roman. Or not. The truth is that no, there are still many campaigns to prepare, many battles to fight, thousands, Tens of thousands of corpses will carpet the fields, and blood will water every corner of this land before the Hispanic peoples are finally subjected to the power of Rome. Unfortunately, from the fall of Numancia to the War of Sertorius, everything is very poorly documented for two reasons. Appian, who you already know is the historian I use for my research, considerably reduces this period to just 2 pages, covering half a century of history with them. On the other hand, we cannot consider the writings of Titus Livius about this era, as those volumes were lost over the years. So as has happened more than once, I will try to create a cohesive, organized, and plausible narrative. Let's go. After the fall of Numancia, Rome expanded Hispania Superior and sent 10 senators to organize the territories conquered in recent years. During the following years, it is known that there were some battles and campaigns on the peninsula, as some praetors or consuls of these years returned from Hispania and celebrated a triumph, for which it was required to have finished with at least 5,000 enemies. The lack of data gives us a break in the year 121 before Christ. The Balearic Islands had hardly received any attention from Rome, so these islands were filling up with wrongdoers, bandits, and most importantly, pirates. These men were not usually natives, but came from other lands such as Sardinia and southern Gaul, something similar to what would happen in the Caribbean in more than 1,500 years. This piracy affected trade and prevented the free movement of people within the Republic, so these pirates had to be eliminated. For the task, Consul Quintus Caecilius Metellus prepared a fleet and set course for the islands. As we already saw in the top 5 severe tribes, whose link I leave up here in case you haven't seen it yet, the Balearic slingers were tremendously precise and feared in the Mediterranean. In fact, they were so precise and lethal that they could pierce the hulls of Roman ships, causing them water entries. To prevent this, Quintus Metellus ordered his ships to be lined with skins to cushion the stone throws and prevent the hull planks from breaking. The campaign was short and ended with the taking of Majorca, where 3,000 discharged veterans were settled, who were given lands to work on. For the moment, piracy had disappeared, although it would be a recurring issue throughout the history of Rome. In the year 114 before Christ, various bands of Lusitanian robbers reappeared, threatening peace in further Spain. They were independent bands, so they did not represent a serious danger. Gaius Marius, in the role of proprietor, was in charge of ending these bands. Yes, the very same Gaius Marius, the reformer of the Roman legions. If the name doesn't ring a bell, I'll leave the link to the video above where you can find out what these reforms were. Now I'm going to step a bit outside of Hispania to give context to what's coming. In the year 120 before Christ, the Cimbri probably migrated from the province of Jutland due to a natural disaster that triggered a sharp rise in sea level, flooding their lands. They could be Celts, Germans, or even a mix of both. They migrated south, joining the Teutons on the march, and together on October 6th, 106 before Christ, they crushed consular armies in the Battle of Arausio, near the Rhone. By life's coincidences, one of the survivors of the battle was Quintus Sertorius, whom we will get to know in great depth later on. The coalition of Cimbri and Teutons could have invaded Italy, but they separated, giving time to Gaius Marius, elected for his 5 consecutive years to prepare the legions and defeat the invader. We will follow the Cimbri, who crossed the Pyrenees and dedicated themselves to plundering the villages and laying waste to the fields. They did not attack any walled city, as they lacked the necessary preparation. They devastated the northern half of Hispania Superior, but they made a mistake. They invaded Cjbeards. And the Cjbeards, seeing that they were being invaded by the Cimbri, raised an army and stood up to them, defeating them and forcing the invaders to retreat and flee through the Pyrenees. Interestingly, a cyclical pattern of wins and losses has emerged. The Romans defeated the Cjbeards. These defeated the Cimbri, who in turn defeated the Romans. The Cimbri joined the Teutons again, and the coalition was defeated and disintegrated after successive victories by Gaius Marius, who was henceforth considered the 3rd founder of Rome. In the year 98 before Christ, Titus Didius, in the position of consul, was sent to Hispania to quell a revolt of the Aravasi, ending with about 20,000 enemies shortly after arriving in the province. Titus Didius's stay continued until the year 93 before Christ, now in the position of proconsul, at which point he returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph for his campaigns. The consul had some brilliant ideas. For example, after a battle with the Aravaci, he collected half of the Roman corpses under the cover of night. When the Aravaci arrived the next day to do the same with theirs, they saw that their dead were more than double that of the Romans. So thinking that the defeat of their people was assured, they accepted peace. Although the consul at times became as severe as Galba or Crassus, devastating everything in his path. For example, when he took the city of Termes, he simply forced its inhabitants to live on a plain without walls. While an example of his bloodthirsty personality comes with the city of Calenda. When he took the city after 9 months of siege, he sold all its inhabitants as slaves, including the children. Taking advantage of the fact that the city had become deserted, he offered it to a nearby tribe that was dedicated to looting the Roman province. The deal was he gave them the city, and they stopped attacking the Romans. When the members of the tribe came to register and thus live in their new city, Tito Tibio surrounded them and slaughtered them, again including children. The revolt was quelled and Tito Tibio returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. For his part, in the year 96 before Christ, Publio Licinio Crasso was sent with the rank of proconsul to Hispania Ulterior, where he fought against new Lusitanian uprisings seeking to free themselves from Roman power. But again, they were independent bands. In the year 93 before Christ, shortly after Tito Didio left, Caio Valerio Flacco was sent with the rank of proconsul to Hispania Citerior to quell a new Celtiberian revolt. There he killed more than 20,000 Celtiberians, and with that, he began a new period of peace in the peninsula, until the appearance on the scene of a brilliant and charismatic man, a one-eyed man, loved by the tribes of Iberia. His name Quintus Sertorius. 82 years before Christ, Sertorius left for Hispania Citerior to take the position of propraetor, but along the way, Sulla put his name on the list of public enemies, so if anyone killed Sertorius, they would do so with total impunity. Sulla also removed Sertorius from his post and appointed Valerius Flaccus to replace him. But Sertorius refused to give in to Sulla's side, so he refused to surrender his troops and continued his march. The usual thing was to disembark at Empures, but the port was blocked by Valerius' troops, so he decided to cross a mountainous pass in the Pyrenees. There he was blackmailed by an Iberian tribe, the Ceretani, who asked him for money to let him pass. Sertorius did not hesitate for a moment because what he needed was time, not money, as Sylla had sent Gaius Annius with an army to hunt him down. Sertorius paid the toll, crossed the Pyrenees, and left Salinator, one of his officers, in command of 6,000 men to defend the pass to prevent Annius from crossing and making it more difficult for him in Hispania. Sertorius knew what he was doing. Defending a mountain pass is a very easy task, even against a numerically superior enemy, as was already proven, for example, in the Battle of Thermopylae. Shortly after Sertorius left, Salinator was murdered by his own men, who had been bribed by Gaius Annius, so the latter was able to cross the Pyrenees and join his forces with those of Valero Flacco without any delay. Of course, suddenly Sertorius found himself with 3,000 men, having to face an overwhelmingly superior force, so he fled to take refuge in Cartagena, determined to play defensively. But once there, he thought better of it and decided to flee to Africa. From this moment on, Sertorius will live adventures worthy of the Greek legends of Troy and the Iliad. First, Sertorius landed in Libya, but they were immediately attacked by natives. There, the popular ones weighed whether it was worth fighting against the natives or it was better to leave and look for a place where they would be better received. Finally, Sertorius decided that it was best to leave the place, so the Romans re-embarked and returned to Hispania. They arrived at the south coast of the peninsula, and after disembarking they were attacked again, although this time by the Optimates. Sertorius re-embarked his men and headed to the Balearic Islands. There he allied with the pirates, and together they took the island of Ibiza. Remember that the pirates had been expelled from the islands many years ago by Quintus Metellus. Sertorius established his base of operations in Ibiza, with the idea of being able to coordinate attacks on the peninsula from there, since an island is a difficult position to conquer. But his peace didn't last long, as Annius sent a fleet of triremes with a legion to finish him off. Sertorius faced a dilemma. He could wait for the Optimates to disembark and thus have a pitched battle, in which he was a great strategist. Although he was clearly outnumbered and could not count on the pirates to help him on land, as they had neither the training nor the intention to fight legionaries in open field. The other option was to join forces with the pirates and together set out with their own fleet to confront the Optimates at sea. The pirates were more skilled than the legionaries in deck combat, so he would have that point in his favor. In addition, pirate ships were much more maneuverable than Roman triremes, so they could quickly reinforce any weak point in the front. Sertorius opted for the second option, and the fleet composed of pirates and populares set off from Ibiza to meet the Optimates. However, a storm hit both fleets as they were heading to fight, causing havoc especially in the popular navy, which lost almost half of its forces. When the storm subsided 10 days later, the populares fled the area heading west, with the intention of getting as far away as possible from the Optimates and their fleet. They crossed the strait and disembarked at the mouth of the Guadalquivir. There, some sailors told him stories of idyllic islands in the Atlantic, a paradise on earth where he could spend the rest of his days without the complications and hardships of war. These islands were probably the Canary Islands. Sertorius was almost convinced, although he finally decided that the peaceful life was not for him. He preferred the adrenaline of and the military life. So he embarked his men and crossed the strait again, determined not to surrender. This time they disembarked in Mauritania and took part in a dynastic dispute, fighting against Ascalis, who was Sulla's claimant to the throne. The dictator, upon learning that Sertorius was in Mauritania, sent an army of legionnaires under the command of Pacianus to finish him off. But Sertorius, a brilliant strategist, was the one who emerged victorious and killed Pacianus himself. Ascalis took refuge in Tingis, now Tangier, and was subjected to a siege by Sertorius and his Mauritanian allies. Tingis finally fell and the dynastic dispute came to an end. Sertorius had achieved his first victory since the death of Gaius Marius, and his name became known throughout the nearby lands, the lands of Hispania. In the year 80 before Christ, a Lusitanian embassy arrived in Mauritania, requesting an interview with Sertorius. These men, attracted by the fame and prestige of Sertorius, asked him to return to the peninsula and free them from the oppression of the governor of further Hispania. 10 days later, Sertorius agreed, and in command of 2,600 legionaries and 700 Libyans, he embarked and set course for Hispania, with the intention of taking the provinces, regardless of his clear numerical inferiority. 80 years before Christ, Sertorius left Africa for Hispania with 2,600 infantrymen and 700 Libyans. On the way, his fleet was intercepted by General Aurelius Cotta near Tarifa. It's really not known whether the confrontation took place on the way to Hispania or days after arriving. The fact is that the Optimate fleet was defeated, and Sertorius achieved his first victory in his new life as a Hispano-Roman leader. Sertorius knew the Hispanos very well, and was aware of their religious devotion, so he decided to take advantage of it to gain their support. A peasant gifted him a newly born white doe of pure white, and it was so docile that it followed Sertorius everywhere, unafraid of the shouts and noises typical of the army. Sertorius told his men and allies that it was Artemis who had gifted him the doe, as the deer is the animal that represents her. Sertorius, when he received information from his spies about imminent enemy attacks, said that the doe had whispered it to him to convince the allies that the gods supported him. The Lusitanians, convinced, handed over 4,000 warriors and 700 horsemen for the fight against Sulla. Sertorius decided that he needed to achieve quick victories before more reinforcements arrived on the peninsula, so he set off to meet the praetor of that year from Hispania Ulterior, Lucius Fufidius, who was with his men near the Betis River. He confronted him and defeated him, thus becoming the master of part of Hispania Ulterior. Afterward, he retired to Lusitania. There, he decided to start training his allies as if they were Roman legions, to provide them with discipline, morale, and experience in order to be able to face Sulla in pitched battle at some point. In the year 79 before Christ, Sulla sent Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, one of his trusted men, as proprietor of further Spain, in command of 2 legions. Shortly after arriving, he set course for Cobriga, a city in favor of Sertorius. It is not exactly known where it was, as it is identified with the current Lagos and at the same time with some ruins near the current Carrion de los Condes. Since he was the praetor of Hispania Ulterior, we assume it is present-day Lagos. On his part, the owner of Hispania Superior, Marco Domicio Calvino, marched parallel to the Tagus towards the rebels' hideout. Sertorio was training his allies, but they were not yet ready and were also clearly outnumbered, so he decided to emulate Viriato and start a guerrilla war. He sent Lucio Irtulello, one of his officers, to stop Calvino, whom he defeated and harassed during his return to Hispania Superior. For his part, Sertorio's large network of spies allowed him to know the intentions of the Optimates at all times. In fact, Plutarch narrates that when a military tribune asked Metellus about his intentions, he replied, "If I believed my tunic knew, I would take it off and throw it into the fire." Still, the precaution was useless as Sertorius discovered Metellus's plans. The Optimate intended to cut off the water supply to the C3 Briga, so they would surrender from thirst. To get there quickly, he had only taken rations for 5 days, as without water, the city would surrender in 2. Error. Sertorius bought 2,000 skins or vessels full of water and took them to the city before Metellus's arrival. When the Optimate arrived and saw that the city would not surrender soon, he sent a legion to fetch supplies to sustain the siege. This legion was ambushed by Sertorius in a gorge, and most were killed or captured. After the defeat, Metellus decided to lift the siege and retreat to friendly territory. The war started well for Sertorius. Metellus decided to fight defensively for a while, as time was initially in his favor. He reinforced the border with Lusitania, building forts from which to stop invasions. The one in Medellin stands out, which would later become a colony and give rise to the current Medellin. This camp also served as a springboard to assault Lusitania. Sertorius founded his own senate. Sertorius's idea was to create a kind of parallel Rome until he could return to the real one. Taking advantage of the strong anti-Roman sentiment in the Celtiberia region, he took over part of Superior Spain, taking cities like Caliguris and Ilerda, now Calahorra and Lleida, and established his base of operations in Huesca. It was also there where he created a school for the children of the leaders of the main tribes of Hispania. This had a dual purpose. Firstly, he sought to Romanize the peninsula and ingratiate himself with the natives, which would give him troops to confront Sulla. But on the other hand, these children were also hostages, so the tribes would not rise up against Sertorius, as he was the one controlling their heirs. Anyway, this academy gave a lot of culture and wisdom to the students. It taught them knowledge that they could not have acquired at home, in addition to teaching them how to speak and write in Latin and Greek. Sertorius appointed governors in the various regions he owned, and appointed himself proconsul. In addition, he significantly reduced taxes for all inhabitants of his territories, which made him even more popular among the Hispanics. With a consolidated territory and more or less defined institutions, he was able to train and equip his allies in the purest Roman style, with high-quality weapons, shields, and protections. But the civil war did not continue only in Hispania. A general, Lepidus, had rebelled against the Senate. I'm not going to dwell on this because it's not the point of the video. I will simply say that his rebellion ended with 53 cohorts, more than 20,000 legionaries opposed to Sulla and commanded by Marcus Perperna, living in Sardinia. Such was the fame of Sertorius that, in the year 78 before Christ, Perperna left the island with his men and went to Hispania to be able to join forces with Sertorius and together have more chances of bending Sulla and defeating the Optimates. Perperna did not have the charisma or the intellect of Sertorius, and yet he refused to put himself under his orders. He preferred to go on his own. However, due to the pressure from his men, he finally put himself at the service of Sertorius. And it was now with an army of 60,000 infantry and 8,000 horsemen, when Sertorius had become a serious problem, a new Viriathus that no one wanted to face. No one except a young general with an impeccable military career. His name, Pompey the Great. Hispania once again was fighting for its freedom. 78 years before Christ, Sertorius, with his enemies cornered, headed towards Caraca, a city located near the Tajunia River that resisted his power. Its inhabitants took refuge on a high hill full of caves whose exits all faced north. The entrance to the caves was practically impenetrable, as a few men could defend the access without problems, due to the steepness of the climb and how exposed the attackers were. Knowing that a direct assault would be a slaughter and possibly end in failure, Sertorius rode around the place on horseback. He found that they could not build a ramp because the quality of the soil was terrible. It crumbled like ash and was carried away by the wind. According to Plutarch, Sertorius found no other entrance to the caves, but noticed that a whirlwind lifted a handful of sand and raised it to the height of the caves. And then he had an idea. He ordered his men to start accumulating that earth on the north face of the hill, which is where the caves were facing. So they spent the day accumulating more and more earth under the mockery of the rebels who knew that this earth would not be useful for making a ramp. The next day the wind blew again and another dust whirlwind arose next to the embankment. At that moment the Romans began to run and jog over the earth they had accumulated the day before. The small whirlwind was feeding on more and more dust until it began to enter the caves and flood everything. Since it was the only entrance to the cave, there was no ventilation, and the rebels began to cough and choke. They finally gave up. In the year 76 before Christ, Pompey entered and in the hither Spain with 30,000 men and set course for Valencia. Sertorius sent Irtuleo to harass Metellus in the ulterior, and Perperna to stop Pompey on the Ebro line. He had given both of them very clear instructions: no facing the bulk of the enemy army in the open field, always skirmishes or safe battles. Spoiler, they ignored his advice. Perpenna was not skillful, and Pompey escaped him and managed to cross the Ebro at a poorly defended point, continuing towards Valencia. His intention was to take the entire coast, so that Sertorius would not have access to the Mediterranean. He bypassed Tarraco, captured Sagunto, and proceeded southward. Here I'm going to highlight something that lacks importance now, but will have it when we see the Second Civil War. In the territories that Pompey controlled, he began to create a network of clients that would guarantee that the inhabitants were loyal only to him. We will see its consequences in the future. Now let's continue with Sertorius. And it is that Sertorius took command of the army and personally set out to stop Pompey, deciding to present battle near Loro. It is not known where this city was located, but it must not have been far from Valencia. And here the Battle of Loro took place. This battle seems quite interesting to me as it shows the desert ingenuity at its finest, as well as the first defeat of Pompey, who was considered invincible until then. That's why I will make an exclusive video about this battle. I'm going to summarize it quickly. Pompey failed miserably. Out of his 30,000 men, he lost 10,000, as well as his entire supply convoy. At night, Pompey withdrew from the camp, losing another 5,000 men, in this case allies whom he had left defending his rear. The city of Lauro, seeing that Pompey had lost, surrendered to Sertorius. He spared the lives of its inhabitants but set fire to the city as punishment for having opposed his power. Meanwhile, Hertuleo in Hispania Ulterior disobeyed Sertorius and faced Metellus in open field near Italica, south of present-day Saint-Pons in Seville, despite being outnumbered. Metellus won, and Hertuleo's army had to flee to Lusitanian territory loyal to Sertorius. However, Metellus pursued him and finally finished him off near present-day Segovia. All of Hertuleo's army disappeared. And it is here when the tables began to turn for Sertorius, who until now had reaped victory after victory. While it is true that he remained practically invincible, such a vast territory also needs an army and a general. And if the other officers are not skilled, the war is lost. In the year 75 before Christ, taking advantage of Sertorius being in the center of the peninsula, Pompey tried again to take Valencia. Defending Valencia was Perpenna, who faced Pompey without hesitation, again disobeying Sertorius's instructions to avoid a large-scale pitched battle. This time Pompey did rise to victory and ended the lives of 10,000 warriors. Perpenna retreated with the survivors of his army, but the damage was already done. Rome could replenish troops almost without limit. Sertorius no. Pompey, confident from his victory, decided to face Sertorius again. He advanced with his men towards Sertorius' positions, not waiting for Metellus's reinforcements that had left from Hispania Ulterior and would arrive by sea to Ceterior shortly. Sertorius needed to fight as soon as possible to face only Pompey's army, and not two at once, so he went to meet Pompey. A battle took place at Sucro next to the Jucar. Sertorius ordered the attack at dusk, and both armies fought until nightfall. Sertorius had about 3,000 casualties, while Pompey had about 6,000. The next day, Sertorius arranged his men in battle order, but he saw from afar that Metellus was arriving in the area with his men, so he changed his mind and withdrew his army to safe territory. Once Sertorius left, Perpenna decided to present battle near Ars, now known as Sagunto. Again he was defeated, losing about 5,000 men to the troops of Metellus and Pompey. With this battle, the campaigns of that year ended, with Sertorius watching his generals lose battles. Seeing his forces slowly but inexorably dwindling, the Silons had decided to change their tactic, and Sertorius was increasingly cornered. 74 BC Sertorius urgently needed reinforcements, and to achieve this he made a pact with Mithridates, king of the Pontus kingdom, to deliver 3,000 talents of silver and 40 ships to Sertorius, in exchange for him sending military advisors. Remember that Mithridates had been the trigger for the first Roman civil war, or at least the cause for which it broke out. If you want to know about the first Roman civil war, click on the link at the top of the screen. Well, while we're at it, you can take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any chapter of our story. I'm going to make a note that I've made several times on the channel. History is written by the victors, and the data may not be entirely accurate. In the campaigns of Sertorius, I have seen several sources that contradict each other. The number of troops, a resolution of sieges like the one at Caliguris, which we will see later. What I'm saying is that, again, I'm going to tell a story that in my opinion is plausible, based on several of the available sources. And now let's continue. For his part, Pompey asked, or we could even say demanded, the Roman senator to send troops, money, grain, weapons, and equipment for his men. The Senate agreed, and Pompey and Metellus received what they had requested. The numerical superiority of the Silani was overwhelming, but they still decided to avoid having battles in the open field, so as not to lose troops if it was not necessary. Instead, they chose to steadily corner Sertorius and his supporters. It was like emulating the strategy that Rome followed to defeat Viriato. Metellus took the city of Bilbilis near present-day Calatayud. For his part, Pompey took the city of Cauca and set course for Pallantia. Here he laid siege to the city and brought down the walls through tunnels. Just before launching the siege, Sertorius arrived to rescue the city and challenged the Selan army to a battle. Pompey, fearing being trapped between Sertorius' troops and the city's defenders, withdrew, giving up on taking Pallantia. Pompey then headed to Calagurris, where he joined forces with Metellus. Together they laid siege to the city. Meanwhile, Sertorius helped Pallantia to rebuild the walls, and when the works were finished, he set course for Calagurris. He arrived and killed 3,000 enemies in battle. Metellus and Pompey decided to abandon the siege, and they withdrew to friendly territory to spend the winter. Pompey went to Gaul while Metellus went to further Spain, where he was greeted with cheers by its inhabitants who were already quite Romanized. Despite the fact that every time Sertorius went into battle he achieved victory, he couldn't be on all fronts at the same time, and his generals didn't possess his command abilities. His territory was shrinking more and more, and the quarrels among his officers were increasing. The Romans accused him of having become barbarized, as he always had a guard of Celtiberian warriors, while the natives complained that they wanted to get rid of the Roman yoke, not to change Sulla for Sertorius. And then, some of the natives began to abandon Sertorius, declaring themselves neutral or favorable to Sulla. In 73 before Christ, Tarraco fell to Pompey while Metellus also advanced like a steamroller. In the year 72 before Christ, Sertorius, tired of being abandoned by the Hispanics, executed some of the students from his academy in Osca, while others he sold as slaves. At this point, Sertorius began to lose his mind and his temperament became more bloodthirsty, aggressive, and frugal. He indulged in constant banquets, allowing the conspirators to seize the opportunity to act. Perpenna, who had never accepted that Sertorius was above him, organized a banquet at his villa, to which he invited Sertorius. Once Sertorius got drunk, Perpenna and his supporters executed Sertorius and his men. Sertorius' rebellion had ended in a single night, although the war continued. And here we have a new similarity with Viriathus. Both were murdered by their own men. Perpenna took command now of all the rebel territories, but the Hispanics abandoned him en masse, as they trusted only in Sertorius. Perpenna, trusting in his leadership abilities, confronted Pompey in open field and was destroyed. I'm going to give my personal opinion here. I honestly don't know what Perpenna was thinking, if every time he led the army into battle he lost. But he was the only remaining leader of the rebellion. After the battle, Pompey's troops found Perpenna in some bushes and brought him before Pompey, who, to prevent the civil war from continuing, executed him. And now the First Roman Civil War had ended 10 years after it broke out. Metellus returned to Italy and celebrated a triumph, while Pompey stayed on the peninsula, quelling the last pockets of resistance, among which Calagurris stood out. According to Plutarch, the siege of this city was on the level of Numancia in terms of the obstinacy of its defenders not to surrender. The city fell and all the resistance foci were extinguished, which expanded Rome's territories on the peninsula. Pompey now showed himself to be affable and conciliatory, expanding his client network. The Vascones, who in one way or another were supporters of Sulla, basically so that the Celtiberians would be punished, began to be Romanized peacefully by Pompey. He also founded new cities like Pompelo, which is now Pamplona. The consuls of that year presented a law so that Pompey could grant Roman citizenship to whoever he deemed appropriate. Pompey skillfully used this law to attract more supporters to his side, so the client network he had created in Hispania was a huge web of spider that caught everyone. According to Plutarch, Pompey was a very poor speaker, but he made up for it on the battlefield and by being extremely popular among the citizens of the Republic. The fact of having created such a large client network in Hispania would prove very useful 20 years later. Now I want to point out something about the map. As you can see, I have annexed all the northern tribes to the Roman Republic in one fell swoop, except the Gallicos, Asturians, and Cantabrians. This is because it is not known when they were annexed. After all, the exact location of Rome's borders in Hispania is not known by any means. The borders you see in the videos are my estimates based on the information that exists from that time. Before the Cantabrian Wars, these peoples were already part of Rome, in one way or another, so it had already annexed them. To tell the truth, it is true that the Battle of Andagoste took place in 38 BC, but it was really something on a small scale, and it is also not known if it was part of a conquest campaign. If anyone knows with total clarity, when these peoples became part of Rome, please send me an email with arguments, and I am willing to accept my mistake in the next video. And now let's continue. It seemed that everything was calm and that there would finally be peace on the peninsula, but that was just the calm before the storm. Well, 3 years later, the most well-known man in the history of Rome would arrive in Hispania to begin his cursus honorum. His name, Gaius Julius Caesar. In the year 69 before Christ, Julius Caesar achieved the position of quaestor, from which he would climb positions in the cursus honorum. If you want to know what the Roman cursus honorum is, click on the link shown at the top of the screen. Caesar was assigned to further Spain to carry out his duties as quaestor. Among other things, he had to administer justice and keep the province's accounts, which included the army's pay. He used his time in office to create a network of clients, just as Pompey had done years before, with the aim that these people would help him in the future. Caesar traveled to Gades, where an anecdote took place in front of the statue of Alexander the Great that was there. It is said that Caesar, upon seeing the statue, said, "At my age, Alexander the Great had already conquered the world, while I have not yet done anything worthwhile." It should be noted that Caesar was going as fast as he could, as he was accessing positions at the minimum necessary age. In no case could he have emulated Alexander because Roman laws prevented him. In this same city, Caesar met Lucius Cornelius Balbus. They became very good friends, and the latter's career would continue to rise thanks to his friendship with Caesar. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Julius Caesar returned to Rome, where he continued his political career. During these years, the history of the peninsula is linked to Julius Caesar, so we will see temporal jumps in the chronology, and that is because right now there were no major altercations in Hispania, or at least that's what the Romans and the Hispanos themselves thought. Everyone except Julius Caesar. It was in the year 61 before Christ when Caesar returned to Hispania, now with the position of propraetor. There he found 20 cohorts, to which he added another 10, recruited from the Hispanic population, helped by Lucius Cornelius Balbus, who was now chief engineering officer. Julius Caesar found himself with an independent command, in a land that had not yet been completely conquered. In addition, Caesar was in debt up to his eyeballs, so he urgently needed to get hold of some loot to pay his creditors. On the other hand, Caesar wanted to reach the position of consul in 59 BC. For this he had to win over the people of Rome. And what did the Roman plebs like the most? Celebrations and victories. He had already held celebrations and games, so what was left was to give a victory to the Republic and celebrate a triumph through the streets of Rome, so that the plebs could acclaim him, and in the votes for consul, his candidacy would be assured. The owner began to suppress the bands of bandits that inhabited the Romanized provinces, but this was not enough to achieve a triumph. He needed something more. He needed a war, a humiliated enemy, and new lands annexed to the Republic. With this in mind, he set off to the Lusitanian territory and ordered the people who still lived in the mountains to come down to the plains and live in cities. As expected, the Lusitanians flatly refused. Caesar already had his casus belli. Caesar declared war on the Lusitanians, who were not yet under Roman rule. What does he say about Lusitanians, Galicians, and everything else he encounters? Let's find out. The Lusitanians could hardly stand up to Caesar's 30 cohorts, which totaled about 15,000 soldiers. They chose to leave Rome and escape to the north, a region Rome had only visited once. Do you remember who it was? Yes, Decimus Junius Brutus Gallico, the man who invaded Galicia for the first time. If you haven't seen the video, I recommend it. You have the link at the top of the screen, and why not? You can also take the opportunity to like the video and subscribe to join the Hispanic Guard and not miss any video. Let's continue. Caesar pursued the Lusitanians to the Duero, but he did not stop and continued north, now facing Lusitanians and Galicians. There is no record that Julius Caesar encountered much resistance in the peninsular territory. The legionnaires plundered the territory and obtained a great loot, which allowed Caesar to pay off part of his debts. However, some of his enemies embarked and fled to an island in the Atlantic, probably the Berlengas Islands, which we have here. It is not entirely certain that this was their intended destination. The fact is that Caesar sent a first assault to the island in small boats, but due to the strong waves, many boats shipwrecked, and those that managed to arrive were prey to the Hispanics. Caesar, enraged, ordered a war fleet to be brought from Cjbeards, thanks again to the help of Balbo. He embarked his men and personally headed to the island. The Hispanics could not now stop the legions and were crushed. Taking advantage that he already had the army embarked, he set course for Brigantium, present-day Betanzos, in La Coruña. The Galicians, upon seeing the warships full of legionaries arrive, immediately surrendered, recognizing the sovereignty of the Roman Republic. Thus, these lands were annexed to Rome. On the other hand, the Galicians paid a significant sum to Caesar, which allowed him to pay off even more debts. This campaign gave him a great deal of prestige, as he had taken the legions to the end of the known world, Finisterre. For these victories, his soldiers cheered him with a powerful word, Imperator, which allowed him to request a triumph with many guarantees of being granted. It wasn't all war either. Let's remember that Caesar was part of the popularis and introduced laws accordingly. The most important was that creditors could only confiscate 2/3 of their debtors' annual income, so that they still had 1/3 to survive. This makes us think that previously there were times when all income would be confiscated, so the debtor has no money to get through the year. After finishing his term, Caesar left for Rome, where he would seek to be named consul and would not return to Hispania until many years later, in the midst of the Second Roman Civil War. Rome has just had 3 civil wars in a row, so it has lost momentum in terms of external conquests. Or at least that's what someone might think. However, Octavian had taken the lands of Illyria and Dalmatia shortly before the Fourth Civil War, so the enemies of the now empire still feared the legions. I strongly recommend that you watch the videos of the Third and Fourth Roman Civil War before continuing, so that you understand the historical context of what is going to happen. Up here I leave you the link to the Third Roman Civil War. During the last 2 civil wars, Hispania had remained on the sidelines. However, Rome soon turned its attention to the peninsula. What happens, or seems to be, is that the tribes subjected to Rome were attacked and harassed by the tribes they had to the north. Hence, Rome always had a ready casus belli. Now that comes to us from Roman sources, so judge for yourselves its truthfulness. As I always say, history is written by the victors. It is said that the Asturians and Cantabrians made incursions into the territory of the Vacae, the Outrigones, and the Termodigi. So, as Dion Cassius narrates, in the year 29 before Christ, Statilius Octorius is sent as proconsul to Hispania to retaliate against the northerners, The author says that the proconsul subjugated the Vacaei, Cantabrians, and Asturians. But as contemporary author Javier Negrete maintains, this is inconsistent. The Vacaei were already under attack to have been subjugated to Rome, so they could not be subjugated again. Surely the proconsul subjugated some Vacaei stronghold of resistance. It is clear that Toro did not subjugate the Cantabrians or the Asturians, as evidenced by the subsequent Astur-Cantabrian wars. The problem is that nothing is known about his campaigns. Calvisio Sabino also celebrated a triumph for his campaigns in Hispania that year, but nothing is known about it either. 2 years later, in 27 BC, Sextus Apuleius also celebrated a triumph for his victories in Hispania, but nothing is known about it either. The problem is that the books that presumably narrate these years, those of Livy, have been lost. The fact is that it was important to finish taking this territory, as it would allow eliminating a border, since it would reach the Cantabrian Sea, which would allow sending more troops to the rest of the empire's borders. By the way, are you subscribed? No? Well, hurry up, subscribe, join the Hispanic Guard so you don't miss any video. And while we're at it, I'm going to take the opportunity to remind you that you can start your own cursus honorum in the Hispanic Guard, becoming part of our Senate, simply by becoming a patron of the channel. I and the entire Guard thank you for it. In the year 27 BC, Augustus said enough. He gathered 6 legions and crossed Gaul, arrived at Tarraco, and on January 1st, 26 BC, he celebrated his inauguration as consul, which was already mere theater, as it was the 8th time he had assumed that position. When spring arrived, he began the campaign that would culminate in the conquest of Hispania. He went up the Ebro with his 6 legions. He headed to Segizama, now Sesamon in Burgos, and established his base of operations there. At that moment, he divided his army into 2. 3 legions fell under the command of Publio Carizio, governor of further Spain, who marched to fight against the Asturians. Octaviano stayed in command of another 3 legions, which advanced north to fight against the Cantabrians. These are 2 different campaigns, so we are going to see them a bit in parallel. Octavio, or Octaviano, divided his army even more, arranging 3 marching columns supported by auxiliaries. This is basically due to the rugged terrain, which prevented large troop movements. The Cantabrians acted as the rest of the peoples of Hispania had done, with guerrillas. They constantly harassed the Romans, preparing ambushes in the mountainous northern lands and constantly attacking their supply lines. The Romans decided to use the same tactic they used against Viriato, to raze everything. They began to burn the fields they passed through and to destroy the villages they came across, pushing the Cantabrians further and further north. However, despite losing their possessions, the Cantabrians did not accept any pitched battle, which was a wise decision. Between the mountains and the fleeting enemy attacks, the Roman advance notably stalled, so the emperor called for 2 more legions to support him. Indeed, the reinforcements would be used to perform a pincer movement. The 9th Hispana and 4th Macedonica legions, although it's not 100% certain that these were the 2, departed from Aquitaine in a fleet and landed on the Cantabrian coast, specifically in Suances, trying to trap the Cantabrians between 2 fronts. While Augustus's column was advancing, a storm broke out, and a lightning bolt struck one of his slaves, coincidentally the one who was lighting the way before them. Octavian took it as a bad omen and decided to return to Tarraco, leaving the command of the campaign to Antistius, governor of Sertorius, Spain. In the year 25 before Christ, the Cantabrians made a mistake. They confronted Antistius's troops in open field, near the city of Vergida. As is often the case in pitched battles, the Roman troops emerged victorious. The Cantabrians retreated to the north even further to Mount Mindio, whose location is unknown. Here the Cantabrians tried to fortify themselves to repel a frontal Roman attack, but Antistius simply surrounded them and prevented supplies from reaching them. Finally, these Cantabrians surrendered due to hunger, Antistius seemed to have subdued the Cantabrians, but we are in the year 25 before Christ, and I have not mentioned Coracota. Where is he? Let's see. Coracota. This man is only mentioned once by Dion Cassius. He does not appear again in any historical chronicle. Here he is referred to as a bandit, whose head had a high price. Today, Coracota is spoken of as if he were someone who had united all the Cantabrian tribes under his command, and had been the scourge of the Romans in the style of Viriathus. But there is no source, I repeat none, that supports that idea. We could think that he was erased from history, something common in Roman history, to not discredit the empire. Okay, but Viriathus is mentioned, and he was a real headache for the Romans. And Vercingetorix, Indibulus, Spartacus, Sertorius, leaders who united under their command a large number of men from different peoples to face Rome. It is possible that Coracota united the Cantabrian tribes, as it is also possible that he did not, that he is a mere nationalist tool of resistance against the invader. Surely if Livy's books had not been lost, we would know for certain the reality about Coracota. But unfortunately, everything about this campaign is confusing and contradictory. Well, let's now go with the Asturians. Remember that to take this territory, Octavian had appointed the governor of Hispania Ulterior, Carisius, who had also divided his army for tactical and logistical reasons. The Asturians, observing this maneuver, also divided their army into three, with the idea of ambushing each of the marching columns separately and preventing them from helping each other. But money is money. The inhabitants of Praegitium, if I pronounced it correctly, whose location is again unknown, probably in exchange for a reward, alerted the Romans to the Asturian intentions, which allowed the Roman governor to save his army, although it is true that he suffered a large number of casualties. Carisio merged his army again and marched on the most important Asturian stronghold, the fortress of Lancia, in present-day Villa Sabariego. The Romans took the city, and the Asturians were forced to lay down their arms. Carisio forced the Asturians to leave the mountains and settle in the plains, something that was already done, for example, with the Lusitanians. He also settled the veterans of his legions, founding in the year 25 before Christ the city of Emerita Augusta. Does it sound familiar? Yes, it is the current Merida. This city would become the main Roman city of Lusitania, and the best preserved one in all of Spain. Since it seemed that both territories had been subjected to Rome, Octavian returned to the capital and made a gesture of great importance. Close the doors of the Temple of Janus. And why is this of great importance? Because the doors of this temple were only closed in times of peace, which indicated Octavian's intentions to maintain peace for a prolonged period. The closing of these doors was a great propaganda tool that later emperors would use to make a good impression among the Roman population. However, Octavian had rushed. The formidable Cantabrian and Asturian warriors still significantly resisted before submitting to Roman rule. 24 years before Christ. The Romans have occupation and pacification troops in the territory of the Asturians and Cantabrians, because even though the war is supposed to be over, it is time to start the process of Romanization of these territories. If you haven't seen the previous video, the one about the campaigns against these lands led by Octavian Augustus himself, click on the link shown at the top of the screen, and remember that you can subscribe to the channel to join the Hispanic Guard. Continuing with the story, it's worth noting that the really belligerent ones will be the Cantabrians. They have already participated in other wars during the conquest of Hispania. They were mercenaries for the Carthaginians during the Punic Wars, and a threat of an approaching Cantabrian army thwarted another attempt to take Numancia. However, the territory most desired by Rome was that of the Astures, as it had important gold mines that would provide an amount of 20,000 pounds of gold annually, an income of great importance for the Roman coffers. That year, the general in charge of the army in Cantabrian territory had received an offer from them to deliver grain and other supplies, which would alleviate the Roman logistical burden. This general was Lamia, and he set off with his men to the agreed place for the delivery of the supplies. However, it was all a Cantabrian ruse. They ambushed the Roman troops and annihilated the entire Roman contingent that was going for the supplies, resuming hostilities with the empire. Lamia did not take it well at all. She ordered all the fields and all the cities of those who denied the power of Rome to be burned. In addition, she cut off the hands of all those prisoners who fell into her power. Faced with such a display of ferocity, the Cantabrians laid down their arms for 2 years. In 22 BC, they rebelled against the governor of their territory, Scipio, who was supposedly ruling without considering the welfare of the Cantabrians. In this case, the Asturians took courage and followed their example, rising up in arms against Gaius Furnius, who governed their territory. Gaius Furnius had little combat experience, but he still advanced slowly, taking the rebel strongholds and dealing with the contingents of Asturian troops that stood in his way. Following this method, Furnius managed to subdue the Asturians again, and now definitively, so that the mines I mentioned earlier began to produce Roman Poles, and the process of Romanization of the Asturian territory began definitively. Returning to the Cantabrians, we have examples of their fierceness and determination to wage war in the texts of Strabo, where he mentions that mothers killed their children before they were taken prisoner, and then they took their own lives. He also narrates how a child, seeing his parents and siblings chained, took a sword and killed them all, then committed suicide. It's interesting, because it seems like the sentiment of Numancia, only instead of being confined to a city, it covered an entire territory. According to Dion Cassius, more of the same. The Cantabrians, if they saw that their fortress was going to fall, they would set fire to all the houses, kill the livestock, and then commit suicide altogether, whether by stabbing themselves, throwing themselves into the flames, or poisoning themselves. A great siege took place at Mount Medulio, where the Cantabrians had fortified themselves. The mountain's location remains unknown. The Romans, following the already established custom of surrounding the enemy and starving them out before making a direct assault, built a palisade with a perimeter of 23 kilometers. Sometime later, when the Cantabrians lost all hope of emerging victorious, they held a great feast in which they consumed all the supplies they had left. Then they poisoned themselves using yew, also known as the Tree of the Gods. The fall of this mountain temporarily ended the war. And again in the year 19 before Christ, the Cantabrians rebelled again, only in a slightly different way. The Cantabrian prisoners from the previous campaigns somehow agreed and decided that on day 10th they would rebel. And so they did. They executed their masters more or less simultaneously and ran back to the Cantabrian territory. Along the way, they spread the rebellion and attacked the poorly defended Roman garrisons, emulating Spartacus in Italy. Augustus decided that it was enough. That territory was lasting too long, so he sent his most prized general, the most loyal Agrippa. He arrived in Hispania determined to be relentless and to put an end to the rebellions once and for all. Just as Scipio and Miliano did to take Numancia, he spent several weeks disciplining and getting his own men into shape. If you haven't seen that video, you can do so by clicking on the link shown at the top of the screen. He forced them to march long distances every day, expelled prostitutes and merchants from their camps, banned gambling, and punished those who did not want to fall in line. Once he believed he was ready, he set off to subdue the rebels. He waged war against them in a long and fierce campaign where various massacres took place that decimated the Cantabrians, definitively taking away their desire to rebel against Rome again. Unfortunately, this campaign is also very poorly documented. But this tactic is double-edged. It can be, as was the case, that the conquered people are so terrified that they do not rebel again, but it can also be the case that the people feel such resentment and have such a thirst for revenge that they rebel again with Masahinko, as happened with Graco and the Celtiberian Wars, whose video you can find at the top of the screen. In addition, to ensure that they did not rebel again, Agrippa deported part of the survivors to other parts of Hispania, so that separated and decimated, they would no longer pose a problem for the empire. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Hispania has finally been completely subdued to Rome. As the Cantabrian Wars conclude, no stronghold remains to resist the empire. 2 centuries have passed since the Scipios, Publius, and Neo landed in Ampurius to face the Carthaginian hosts led by the Barca brothers. 200 years of wars and more wars, of constant rebellions by the Hispanics, of impregnable strongholds like Numancia, of charismatic leaders like Vigliato, and of fierce warriors like the Cantabrians. This land has seen Roman civil wars, clashes between powers, German invasions, and despite all the bloodshed, despite the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of deaths over these years, Hispania has been annexed to Rome. And it all started with a city from my land, Sagunto. It's been nearly 2.5 years since this adventure began. More than 20 videos dedicated to the Roman conquest of Hispania, and over 40 videos in general on the channel. At the time of writing these lines, we are 5 legions in the Hispanic Guard, 30,000 subscribers. But I'm sure that when you hear these words, we will be more. And now it remains to decide, ladies and gentlemen, what to deal with next. Personally, I believe that the period from 19 BC to the beginning of the Visigothic kingdom has little, how to say it without hurting feelings, little interest. Let me explain. Hispania will be one of the most Romanized provinces, and there will no longer be as many battles as we have seen until the end of the Cantabrian Wars. Hispania will be an important territory in the Roman Empire, there is no doubt. A very important territory. But that will not witness any invasion, because all its borders are protected. We can jump to the arrival of the Visigoths in Hispania, and deal with the entire Visigothic kingdom, of which I personally know absolutely nothing, and perhaps it would be interesting to learn and disseminate about it. The other option would be to jump to 711 after Christ, and the Muslim invasion. But in that case, I think the historical context would be lost. Some would not understand why it is called the Reconquest. Some would align with the Black Legend and anti-Spanish sentiment, because what would be seen as a Christian people taking Muslim lands, without knowing the past. So what do we do? Remember that this channel is about the history of Hispania. Then the main series cannot be about Rome or other territories. We have talked about the Roman civil wars, and aspects of the legions because they are things that affected the development of Hispania, but always keeping the focus on the peninsula. We can open other series to deal with Roman emperors, no problem, and rest assured that we will continue talking about Roman topics but less and less frequently, because we have to make way for new times. Now remember that in the Hispanic Guard, you can enter the Senate and make your own cursus honorum. In other words, you can become a patron of the channel. If the support is sufficient, I could try to increase the frequency of videos and perhaps always keep, among the monthly videos, one that is about Rome, or for example about an emperor like Trajan that you have asked me a lot. Being a patron has many advantages like the bracelet, the medallion, or the first-person videos like the one of Julius Caesar. Give me a chance, if you like my work. Take a look at the Patreon page and consider helping me financially. Thank you very much, and as always, if you liked the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Gentlemen, strength and honor.